And one important point on this chart is that you notice that one of these money comes from imports and the other doesn't. If the federal government wants to spend more money than the states are willing to give it, then the only option that it has is to raise tariffs. There's a lot of people that have uttered the phrase, it's all about the economy, jobs, jobs, jobs. Well, if the federal government wants to have out-of-control spending, imagine the effect, at least for a while. Eventually the tariffs would dry up their revenue source, but imagine the effect for a while if the only way the federal government can gain money for its out-of-control spending beyond what the states are willing to give it is by raising tariffs. The products from China and Korea and Brazil and everywhere else would become more expensive. The government would shrink. People would be laid off from government jobs, but at the same time the private sector would increase because we would be building more things here. And so we would have a change in our workforce from a service-oriented economy back to an industrial economy. So the effects of just this subtle change are profound without any other legislation. He who controls the wealth controls the government. Originally, the states were intended essentially as a fourth of 5 branches of government. Both of these amendments pertain directly to that fact. The states sat between the people and the federal government. So a nice trivia question to ask is, well, who's the 5th branch of government? I just answered that. The people are the 5th branch of government. Essentially, that's at least in certain respects what the 2nd Amendment pertains to. The 16th Amendment bypasses the states, creating a direct link between you and the federal government. This is one of the reasons why there's so much resentment of government. Is first of all, you have a direct link to this amorphous, undefined federal body that sits hundreds, if not thousands, of miles away from you, as opposed to most of the decisions being made by not only an office that you could actually go and visit your county commissioners, talk to them on the phone, run into them and out when you're shopping or going to a restaurant or even in church, or if you're upset with it enough as it is, just run for the office yourself and it's actually in theory attainable, versus these higher positions like governor or senator or president, which are not only hard to get in contact with, but the positions are rather unattainable. These people are making all these decisions from thousands of miles, hundreds or thousands of miles away, and so there's a certain amount of resentment from government, and I think that's at least part of the source of that problem. But anyway, regarding the taxes, Madison had a constitutional crisis. He had several groups that were opposing his constitution. One of them were referred to as anti-federalists, which I'm not going to cover here, but one of the other ones that was causing him problems was the southern states. What the southern states basically said was every time James Madison tried to come up with a plan for representation, they'd say, well, you have to count all of our people, otherwise we won't ratify your constitution. Every time he tried to come up with a plan for taxation, they'd say, well, you can't tax our property, otherwise we won't sign your constitution. Hopefully you understand that, unfortunately, the southern states were referring to slaves in both of these cases. Furthermore, they were basically trying to have their cake and eat it too, and jeopardizing the entire foundation of our country in the process. But James Madison was an exceptionally clever individual. I continue to be amazed by the way he thinks on a day-in, day-out basis, and he's arguably one of my favorite people to study. So what did James Madison do? He turned around and said, well, we went to war on the concept of no taxation without representation. Let's just turn that on its head for a moment. Let's have no representation without taxation. So here's what I propose. The states are going to count their own people. And based on each representative that they send to the House, they're going to pay 1 unit of taxes. So if you send 1 representative, you pay 1 unit of taxes. If you send 10 representatives, you pay 10 units of taxes. And basically he took the whole problem, bundled it up, pushed it to the states and said, here you go, you decide. It effectively shut the southern states up. They quit complaining because now all of a sudden they had to put their money where their mouth is. If they wanted to count all their slaves for representation, then they had to pay more taxes. If they wanted to fudge it to the high side to get more representation, they paid more taxes as well. If they didn't want to count any other slaves, then they would pay less taxes, but they would also lose representation. If they wanted to fudge their numbers even lower, again, they would lose even more representation. And so it was essentially a natural check and balance. It didn't require any laws in order to regulate, which is great. There was not another bureaucracy formed within the federal government. So let's read the Federalist Paper 54 for just a moment. In one respect, the establishment of a common measure for representation and taxation will have a very salutary effect, as the accuracy of the census to be obtained by Congress will necessarily depend in a considerable degree on the disposition, if not on the cooperation of the states. It is of great importance that the states should feel as little bias as possible to swell or reduce the amount of their numbers. Were their share of representation alone to be governed by this rule, they would have an interest in exaggerating their inhabitants. If the rule to decide their share of taxation alone, a contrary temptation would prevail. By extending the rule to both objects, the states have opposite interests, which will control and balance each other and produce the requisite impartiality. So there you go, in Madison's own words. I like this. That's not a history professor's take on it. That's Madison saying for himself what was going on at the time. You can't get much better than that. Here's some benefits. There was no tie between the individual and the federal government. A lot of people are concerned about things like Real ID, E-Verify, RFID, even Social Security numbers. None of this existed because there was no tie between the federal government and yourself. Now, there was obviously somewhat of a tie between you and the state, but you could always move to another state if you were concerned about what was going on there. I guess theoretically you could move to another country, but how many of us that consider us patriots want to leave the United States? The states collected the taxes. The states also conducted the census. I want you to think for just a moment about one effect the 16th Amendment has on the census in the states. What's one requirement commonly made of census workers, or at least it's very strongly preferred that this census workers have this trait, and that's bilingual. They need to be able to speak English and Spanish. The reason for that is that the states are trying to count illegal immigrants. Well, if the states, right now the states get not only more representation if they swell their numbers, but they also get more money from the federal government, since the money flows from the federal government to the state, not the other way around. But there's no negative to it. They don't wind up paying more taxes as a result of counting illegal immigrants, so they're going to try to count every one of them as they can. And if the opposite was true, then the states would actually be very strongly incented to do the exact opposite. They would not want the illegal immigrants at all because they'd wind up having to pay taxes for their illegal immigrants, and that's that hits them in their pocketbooks. I'd love to. I have a funny feeling California won't vote to repeal the 16th Amendment. There's a lot of other states that might, because all of a sudden Hollywood would have to literally put their money where their mouth is. So yes, if states were tempted to report greater population in order to gain representation, the people would pay more taxes. Report lesser, they'd pay less taxes. We've covered that. Modern implications. This is my favorite one. The IRS would be eliminated. I've gotten an applause almost every time I've given this presentation in person just for that one alone. Now, the states do not necessarily have to create a state IRS if they choose tax systems such as a flat tax. The IRS could not hold 501c3 regulations over churches in order to keep them silent, and that's actually what led me to this when I was studying some of the problems with the First Amendment misconceptions. And the other paper is that right now the IRS can hold things like 501c3 rules over charitable organizations, or the federal government can withhold funds from schools, and it really weakens the degree to which they're willing to resist federal mandates.